Welcome to Golden Blue, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget about the checklist. Hat check, sunglasses check, Pepsi check, notes check, sources check, and thick skin is a check. And don't forget to sing gear to represent your team and yourself in my background. Send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina, 29657, and get yourself a shout out. On to the next video. Sorry guys, this will not be a Get It Gang video. If you're not familiar with what the Get It Gang is, it's basically a name that I came up with for the group of people that leave video ideas in the comment section of my videos. So if you think you have a good video idea, leave it in the comment section of my videos and I just might use it. Sometimes people leave comments not intending it for it to be a video idea, but I like the comments so much that it still turns out to be a video idea. So just keep that in the back of your head. So this video is based on the fact that the Pac-12 might be falling apart. I've made multiple videos that it's not looking good for the Pac-12. Their TV deal is looking absolutely terrible. It looks like they're going to get a tier right deal with Amazon worth $100 million. That's just $10 million per team per year. And also a 5-year deal with ESPN, also worth just $100 million per year, which would also be $10 million per team per year. ESPN is also going to buy $10 million worth of content from the Pac-12 network every year for those 5 years. But that's just to offset the $50 million that they owe Comcast. So really what it comes down to is $20 million per team per year. It is terrible. And I'm also hearing that San Diego State and SMU might actually be turning down the Pac-12. This might be the end of the road for the Pac-12. So what I wanted to do for this particular video is give out all the plausible options for every team left in the Pac-12, not counting USC and UCLA. And at the very end, I'll give you a couple of obscure, weird scenarios that I don't think are plausible, but could maybe possibly be possible. So first up, let's talk about Oregon. What are Oregon's options if the Pac-12 goes under? Well, I think it comes down to Oregon and Washington. I think they want to leave with Washington. They could leave together to the Big Ten, or they could leave together to the Big 12 if the Big Ten doesn't invite them, and then eventually get the invite to the Big Ten. So they could use the Big 12 as a stepping stone. But there's another option that's floating out there that I've heard. I've heard that the ACC has been talking to Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford. That would be interesting, and if you really think about it, besides geography, it actually makes sense. All four of those schools have great academics, and the ACC is known as a good academics conference. And remember, the Big Ten did grab USC and UCLA, so geography really doesn't matter anymore. So I think that is possible. So the second scenario for Oregon would be Oregon going with Washington, Cal, and Stanford to the ACC. The next team is going to be Washington. I think the first scenario could be Washington and Stanford to the Big Ten. This makes sense because the Big Ten is getting a great football brand with Washington and a great academics university with Stanford. You'd have a great 1-2 punch right there. And who knows, bringing in Stanford might attract Notre Dame. The second option for Washington is what I just mentioned with Oregon. Going with Oregon to the Big Ten if they get the invite, or going with Oregon to the Big 12 and using it as a stepping stone and then eventually getting an invite to the Big 10. But I also mentioned the ACC option. Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford going to the ACC. The more you think about it, the more it actually makes sense. But there's actually a fourth option for Washington as well, and that's Washington and Washington State going to the Big 12. If Oregon is dead set, no way, I am not going to the Big 12, Washington be like, well, it's not guaranteed that we're going to the Big 10. So if the Big 12 will take us and Washington State, we're going to the Big 12. And I do think the Big 12 would take Washington and Washington State. Remember, Brett Yormark says he wants games in all 4 time zones. Well, the only time zone he's missing right now is the Pacific time zone. So if it takes Washington and Washington State to get that Pacific time zone, he's going to take it. I do think that there's a very, very small chance that the Big Ten just doesn't want Oregon, but they would take Washington with Washington State. Next team is Utah. I think Utah only has 2 options. The first option is the obvious option. Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State going to the Big 12. And Brett Yormark is making every decision possible that he can think of to encourage those 4 teams to come to the Big 12. But there is a second option that nobody's talking about. But I do think it's possible. And that's Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State going to the ACC. Remember what I talked about earlier? I really have heard that the ACC is talking to Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford. Well, if that falls through, maybe the ACC would bring in the Four Corners. That would also make sense for the ACC because these are great academic schools as well. And to be honest with you, the geography would make even more sense than if the ACC brought in Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford. Yes, I do think it is a possibility. The next team is Oregon State. And sorry, Oregon State, but I think you only have one option if the Pac-12 implodes. And that's going with Washington State to the Big 12. And the only reason the Big 12 would do this was to use Oregon State and Washington State as bait to try to get Oregon and Washington. So really, if you're not interested in the Mountain West and you're not interested in a much weaker Pac-12, your only option would be if the Big 12 is willing to bring you in to try to get Oregon and Washington. Plus, you know, what I just mentioned, Brett Yormark wants that Pacific time zone. And if he can't grab anybody else and the only choice is Oregon State and Washington State, I do think he would bring in Oregon State and Washington State. The next team is Washington State. I actually think they have three options. The first option I just mentioned, Washington State going with Oregon State to the Big 12, being used for bait to get Washington and Oregon. Or it's the only choice that Brett Yormark has to get that Pacific time zone. But the next choice is, and I've already mentioned it, Washington and Washington State going to the Big 12. Once again, Oregon saying, no, we are not going to the Big 12 no matter what. Washington's like, well, the Big 10 is not inviting us as of right now. We're not staying. We're going to the Big 12. They'll take us and Washington State. And oh, yes, it would give Brett Yormark that Pacific time zone. And finally, the last choice is Washington State and Washington to the Big 10. What if the Big 10 does want Washington, but they don't want Oregon? That is a distinct possibility. Now, I think it's actually more likely that they could get Washington and Stanford, but they might be willing to go with Washington and Washington State. That's not a bad choice for the Big 10. You're locking in an in-state rival. You are getting the best brand that's left in the Pac-12 in Washington. And Washington State actually has a top 25 fan base when it comes to fan base size. So that's not a bad get for the Big 10. The next team is Arizona. They have three choices. They can go with Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah to the Big 12, aka the Four Corners to the Big 12. Or they could go with Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah if the ACC is interested to the ACC. In other words, if the talks between Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford fall through, and the ACC is interested in the Four Corners, maybe they could go to the ACC. And finally, the last choice is just going with Arizona State to the Big 12. Maybe Colorado and Utah are not interested in the Big 12, but Arizona and Arizona State are like, yeah, we're jumping from this sinking ship. We are willing to go to the Big 12. I think the Big 12 would bring in just Arizona and Arizona State if that's the case. Next team is Cal. I actually think they have two choices as well. The first choice is going with Stanford, Washington, Oregon to the ACC. I mentioned that earlier. And the second choice is going with Stanford to the Big 10. And I actually think that's the highest likelihood as far as the Big 10 grabbing two teams out of the Pac-12. They have great academics. They have AU status. And it could encourage Notre Dame to join the Big 10. Next team is Arizona State. I actually think they have three options as well. First option is going with Arizona, Utah, and Colorado to the Big 12, aka the 3/4 to 4 corners going to the Big 12. The second option is going with Arizona, Utah, and Colorado to the ACC if the deal or the talks with Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford fell through. That would be a nice backup plan for the ACC. And finally, I mentioned it earlier in the video, going with Arizona to the Big 12 if Colorado and Utah decide, no, the Big 12 is not for us. And there's Stanford, and I do think Stanford has some options. The first option is going with Cal, Oregon, and Washington to ACC if those talks do indeed lead to them going to the ACC. Then there's going with Cal to the Big 10, and I think that's actually the likeliest choice for the Big 10 as far as getting two teams out of the Pac-12. And then finally, Stanford and Washington to the Big 10. I think the Big 10 will be getting the best football brand remaining in Washington and one of the best academic universities in the Pac-12 in Stanford. Finally, the last thing, Colorado. I think they have two options as well. Let's go with Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State to the Big 12, aka the Four Corners to the Big 12. Or going with Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State to the ACC. Yes, I do think there's a decent shot that the ACC could be interested in the Four Corners. So maybe that battle between the Four Corners could come down to the Big 12 or the ACC. Might do a video on that. That's a nice video idea right there. And finally, the last category, and that's the weird scenarios. Do I think this is plausible? Not really. Do I think it's possible? Barely. And that's Arizona, Arizona State, Washington, and Washington State going to either the Big 12 or the ACC. So you're getting two of the Four Corners in Arizona and Arizona State, and you're getting the two Washington schools going to either the Big 12 or the ACC. If that's the choice for Brett Yormark, he's going to take it because it gets him that Pacific time zone. It's a weird combination, but he gets what he wants in the Pacific time zone, and he gets half of what he wants as far as getting 2 of the teams that make up the 4 corners. So y'all let me know in the comments section. Number 1, do you think that the Pac-12 is going down like I think it is? And number 2, do you think any of these scenarios that I just mentioned are possible? Finally, number 3, which of these scenarios do you think is most likely to happen? That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.